I want to begin by posing some questions that emerged for me as I thought through the provocation for this workshop. And these are questions that I know you've been discussing in various ways throughout the tour. What is the promise of non-racialism? Are there socialities outside the frame of the racial? And if so, what is the point of looking for them? Must one be non-racial to struggle against racism? Of course, there are different ways in which a notion of the non-racial can have critical purchase, where some scholars have argued that race still has meaning as a social and political fact. Others have suggested that there is no race without absolutism and essentialism, that it cannot ultimately be thought without also thinking the evolutionary and biological models that legitimated its discriminatory institutionalization. We know that distinctions perceived as racial have undergirded strategies of disciplinary and biopolitical governance and have also given meaning to superstate projects related to rights discourses and/or humanitarianism. Imagining a space of non-racialism in its most progressive guises, therefore, suggests a reframing of modernity, an ontological reordering that offers up possibilities of gathering in common that are not reduced to the forms. Hello, 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 hello. All right, it's working? Everybody can hear? You're sure? In the back? Ish. And now it's better? All right. All right. What was I saying? That thinking non-racially could suggest an ontological reordering that would facilitate gathering in common in a way that doesn't redound to the distinctions that have divided us over the past 500 plus years. So this is not the same thing as believing there will eventually come a moment beyond race, or that there will inevitably be an afterness to racial thinking. There's no intrinsic valor in colorblindness, nor is there necessarily any kind of emancipatory political project in multiculturalism. Sincere collectivity can only be forged through the recognition that race is not a property. It is a relation with a history, many histories, in fact. My talk today is concerned with tracking these histories, with elucidating how raciality has been linked to other projects over time at different levels of scale, and indeed how these scales have created the conditions for different articulations of these projects. This is not an unfamiliar position to the people gathered here, to those accustomed to thinking deeply about how the social, the political, and the intimate have worked through racial processes. Posthumanism has been posed as one of the more recent theoretical interventions, critiquing the Enlightenment, humanism, liberalism, and scientism that still seems to infuse non-racialism. The post-human is also part of a broader ontological turn across the disciplines, a turn that has generated quite a bit of contemporary rethinking. But today, I want to be a little more retro, theoretically. I want to remind us of two strands of thought, transnational feminism and the kind of relationality articulated by Edouard Glissant, in order to remember that to think about politics, economy, and sociality in the name of race is to recognize a foundational yet dynamic historical process that is constantly being reframed and reimagined as contexts change. Transnational feminism, in both its social scientific and humanistic incarnations, has been an approach to both knowledge and action that seeks to understand processes, places, and subjectivities in terms of relation rather than intersection within the broader context of contemporary global economic, political, and sociocultural systems. Within this intellectual and political space, so-called third world women and their allies work collaboratively to elaborate the multiple and overlapping forms of inequality through which the exercise of power is made possible within a context of capitalist globalization. Here, woman, qua woman, has not been an identity category, but instead offers a conceptual space through which to analyze the articulations among embodied subjects, global and regional processes of production and consumption, and juridical, legislative, and executive authority. Theirs was and continues to be an explicitly political project, both in the academy and the world beyond it. Glissant's Poetics of Relation, on the other hand, does not center politics or activism, though it also offers a transnational racial analytic, an emphasis on deterritorialization within a context of globalization, and a critique of universality. Glissant's emphasis on poetics rather than politics is an attempt to move beyond what he termed atavistic identity, and to therefore reformulate colonial modernity outside the usual binaries that frame it, among them resistance and accommodation. Glissant sought instead to foreground connectivity over origins, creolization over roots, and archipelagos over nation-states, in the view that this kind of analytic frame would not be trapped by the promises of teleological futurity that often structure our political aspirations. So what does this have to do with archives? It's in the sphere of the relational transnational that regressive racial projects have been deconstructed and progressive ones mobilized. In the first instance, I'm thinking of the ways scholars like C.L.R. James and Eric Williams debunked notions of European supremacy, about which I'll say more in a minute. And in the second instance, I'm thinking of movements like Pan-Africanism, Ethiopianism, feminism, and Rastafari. In both kinds of contexts, transnational formations are central, and it's in archiving these formations that we gain our most profound insights about living with and through power. Archives of the racial, therefore, do not just tell us about constraints or about the legacies of institutionalized discrimination. They can also tell us about the complicated ways in which people sustain themselves within conditions of exception, as well as about the changing conditions of that exceptionality itself. Therefore, if we're to forge coalitions to fight racism and to imagine more profound notions of repair, we must illuminate the parameters of raciality across time and space through a kind of radical witnessing. In post-colonial South Africa, there's been a strong impetus to do this kind of witnessing, to generate archives that would offer insights into the relationships among history, memory, identity, and everyday life among both academics and artists. Today, I want to offer a perspective on the ways these processes have proceeded in the post-colonial West Indies, with an ultimate emphasis on Jamaica, in order to think through the extent to which and the ways in which they've been transformative of our social and political lives. I'll start by briefly laying out the context for archiving race in the New World, and will then move to a discussion of the kinds of archives that have been developed in the Caribbean and how they've been linked to broader processes of internationalism, Pan-Africanism, and later nationalism. Finally, I'll discuss some of the recent archiving work I've been doing in Tivoli Gardens, a so-called garrison community in downtown Kingston, Jamaica, that has long been the stronghold constituency of the Jamaica Labour Party, and where at least 76 civilians perished during the police-military action in May 2010 that was designed to apprehend and extradite Christopher Dudus Coke, leader of the Shower Posse and Dawn of the community. I will argue something like this. Archives that are conceptually organized in relation to transnational and relational fields deconstruct official, state-sanctioned racial vindications because they provide us with windows through which to see continued racial discrimination vis-a-vis other forms of social division, ethnic, gendered, religious, sexual, political, and through contemporary reorganizations of sovereignty. These continuities and changes are made especially visible when we create archives of violence, which itself both exposes and obscures how sovereignty is reorganized over time, as well as how it's embodied at particular junctures. What I will show is that the process of producing these kinds of radical archives opens a space of potentiality, one that might catalyze new possibilities for seeing connections previously unexamined and for reordering our ontological taken for granteds like time and space, politics and justice. Producing these types of archives is a form of witnessing, as Achille reminds us. The task of the witness is to reopen the emancipatory possibilities, which, as a consequence of the structured blindness and collective self-deception of the age, are in danger of foreclosing the future. I want to argue that this kind of witnessing is what the development of a visual archive of state violence can catalyze. It can shift the politics of reparations away from the discretely local and legally verifiable events and toward the long and slow processes undermining our ability to forge social and political community together. It also urges us to be more skeptical about nationalist narratives of perfectibility, whereby we triumph over past prejudices and injustices through a force of will and commitment to moral right, instead encouraging us to train our vision more pointedly to the transnational geopolitical spheres that constituted the frame of reference for earlier internationalists and that infused the social and political worlds of contemporary postcolonials. At the same time, it can help us to focus on the everyday ways people innovate life without constantly projecting today's struggle into a future redemption. And finally, because witnessing is the modality through which people reinsert politics into everyday meaning-making, this kind of archive can help us to see and hear differently. It can cultivate a sense of mutual recognition that not only exposes complicity, but also demands collective accountability. Caribbean archives. One of the agendas of Caribbean studies as a field has been to generate archives, or more accurately, counter-archives, or as some would prefer, assemblages that challenge the archives collected and disseminated by states and other forms of sovereign authority. We've generated these counter-archives in order to make claims about the significance of the Caribbean to global processes that have shaped the modern world for the past 5 centuries. We've been inspired by historical, literary, and ethnographic evidence to develop arguments about the region's centrality to the development of mercantile and later industrial capitalism, to a system of racialized labor management and contemporary class and cultural stratifications, to ideologies and practices linking gendered and racialized subjectivities to patterns of state formation, sovereignty, and imperialism, to the development of, quote, new and creatively creolized social and expressive cultural practices, to revolutions and modern social movements, and to contemporary processes of transnationalism. The point of these counter-archives, of course, has been to establish the humanity of Black people throughout the Americas, quite literally, through a refutation of explicitly racist observers such as Carlyle, Froude, and de Gobineau, as well as of an emergent anthropology that before the Boasian Revolution was often aligned with the various forms of evolutionism, social Darwinism, and scientific racism that emerged in the mid and late 19th century. Counter-archives thus have been developed as a response to the forms of racism that produced the ideological terrain of the post-contact New World and of the Old World ideological scaffolding that created the New World as a space of classification and intervention. Some have seen the process of archive creation as simultaneously a process of Black memory making. Black memory, it's claimed, and more specifically New World Black memory, constitutes something of a special case, as it's produced and reproduced within a context often characterized by an absence of ruins. This title of Orlando Patterson's second novel is meant to foreground experiences of rupture, pastlessness, and fragmentation, legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, that are often seen as constituting the historical and discursive context for the majority New World African populations. Indeed, 3 generations of writers and literary critics have attempted in different ways to reconstruct the lives of those who were or would become slaves, to glean insight into their aspirations, their imaginations, and their day-to-day movements by putting together a mention in a diary here, a list in a log there. These acts of reconstruction are oriented toward the creation of an historical consciousness that challenges forms of state memory, and this is why they constitute what Tony Bogues calls a dread history. They are projects that not only counter dominant tropes about the region and the people who have inhabited it, but also potentially provide the basis for claims about the relationship between present inequalities and past injustices, as Mike Hanchard has argued. In other words, the basis for projects of reparative justice. Today I want to interrogate the limits of this counter-archive. I want to ask more pointed questions about what is at stake in the production of presences where there have been absences, in the creation of challenges to colonial representations of the world and the post-colonial world as it should be. I want to think about the broader geopolitical and epistemological dimensions of this production and to question the sense of temporality that undergirds it. I want to place racially vindicationist post-colonial nationalist archives alongside deconstructionist transnational ones in order to explore the effects of the post-independence context of developmentalism and the extent to which this has discouraged the global geopolitical and structural historical macro perspective that undergirds a reparations logic. And I want to specifically ask what we can learn about the limits of this counter-archive from violence. In order to begin this exploration and to give a sense of the ideological terrain with which both deconstructionist and vindicationist impulses have had to contend, let me back up to the story of modern race-making, which has been well documented. We know from Sylvia Wynter that the effect of the 1550 debate between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda was a delineation of racial hierarchy in the language of the potentiality for Christian conversion. From Norman Whitten, we understand that the settling of the New World also saw the twin transformative processes of racial fixing of diverse African peoples into negros and diverse indigenous New World populations into indios, and racial flexibility, the various configurations of creolization, transculturation, and hybridity. And that these were processes that became institutionalized through particular extractive labor regimes and constellations of citizenship that excluded non-European groups. Shona Jackson has shown us that these distinctions between indigenous and African peoples also set the stage for systems of management, exploitation, and ultimately nationalist belonging that have been rooted in notions of temporal difference, something Beth Povinelli has called the governance of the prior. And historical anthropologist Irene Silverblatt has demonstrated that ideas about purity of blood and heritability further developed through debate within institutional structures like the Inquisition tribunals in the Viceroyalty of Peru during the 16th and 17th centuries. Finally, from Michel Rothschild and Tom Holt and David Theo Goldberg, among others, we know that the idea of race and the hierarchical institutionalization of racial difference emerged dialectically in relation to these early projects, with mercantilism inaugurating material, religious, political, philosophical, scientific, and ideological processes that indelibly linked the new world and the old in a common project of defining modern subjectivity in racial terms. This initial institutionalization of racialized notions of difference would be subsequently mobilized to serve the late 19th century British project of indirect imperial rule throughout Africa and South Asia, as well as the new imperialist project of the United States. This later period also spurred an intensification of labor migration, the development of technological innovations, and the elaboration of science, through which we would see the emergence of various strands of social Darwinism that would shape the institutionalization of notions of racialized civilizational difference in forms like apartheid and Jim Crow. These emergent sovereignties would be challenged by the imagination of both political and social life beyond the territorial boundaries of the nation-state through visions of Ethiopianism, internationalism, Garveyism, and Pan-Africanism, by late 19th century anti-slavery struggles, as well as mid-20th century anti-colonial and native self-determination struggles, as well as later civil rights and Black Power movements, feminism, and the universal human rights mobilizations of the mid-century and beyond. Thus, the two moments of European expansion to the New World and 19th century indirect imperialism generated both the material and ideological frames for understanding 20th and early 21st century racial processes in the circum-Atlantic world. The link between nation building and race, for example, has produced the various models of nationalist creolization we see throughout the Americas. Models Ron Stutzman once famously called all-inclusive ideologies of exclusion. Mestizaje, creolité, métissage, négritude, mestissaging, afro-latinidad, hispanidad, democracia racial, and multiculturalism. In producing liberal projects of racial vindication, these models have tended to marginalize the more radical historical critique of racialized global geopolitics that emerged from the British West Indies during the interwar years. It's to this critique that I want to now briefly turn. Two of the earliest classics of Caribbean history, Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, were designed as antidotes to European notions of legitimacy and governance. Williams himself saw his project as one that would rework and reevaluate, quote, our conceptions of history and economic and political development. He set out to do what we would now call a transnational historical exegesis of, quote, the role of Negro slavery and the slave trade in providing the capital which financed the Industrial Revolution in England, and of mature industrial capitalism in destroying the slave system, end quote. His was primarily a study of British economic history, one designed to refute the approaches to slavery and its disillusion that foregrounded the role of abolitionists. In arguing that the primary forces responsible for emancipation were economic, he demonstrated the bankruptcy of European claims to moral superiority and legitimate governance, and made a critical argument for independence. Williams' concern, therefore, did not lie primarily with vindicating the agency, organizational skills, or revolutionary leadership of those deemed incapable of such traits, though in a footnote he does direct readers to James's Black Jacobins, a text that for him corrected the historical distortion of not addressing the role of slaves in the abolition of slavery. Indeed, James's agenda in this other classical historical text was to argue against the prevailing idea that Black people were not competent to govern themselves by showcasing Toussaint Louverture's skills as a strategist and leader. Much has been written about the context for James's ideological formation, and therefore for his elaboration of this tale in Black Jacobins. A Trotskyite, James, like many other Black communists during the interwar period, was disgruntled by Stalin's turn away from internationalism and the growing focus on expanding socialist bureaucracy within nation states. For James, the collapse of internationalism, coupled with the rise of fascism in Europe, exposed the bankruptcy both of liberal democratic Western states and of the Communist International. Moreover, a growing Pan-Africanism after Italy's two attempts at colonizing Ethiopia in 1895 and 1935 had many Black intellectuals and activists throughout the Black Atlantic and West and Southern Africa galvanized globally toward anti-imperialist agitation and critical discussions of race and empire. Black Jacobins, then, was part of a more general deconstructionist struggle to tell the history of Haiti, and more broadly of the West Indies, from the point of view of Haiti rather than of France. One of the incidental effects of this focus correlates with Williams' project. That is to say, it gives some context for the argument that Britain's abolition of the slave trade in 1807 was a direct result of economic and social fallout caused by the Haitian Revolution, and not primarily due to the work of abolitionists. James was also interested in revolution itself, how it happens, what drives people to participate, how people make and break fragile alliances, and this preoccupation reveals his own agenda. If James's view of colonial plantation development was that of a system of degradation and dehumanization, one that broke an idyllic pre-colonial African life, then anti-colonial revolution had to be conceptualized as restoring humanity through the achievement of sovereignty. Demonstrating that this particular revolution was waged by slaves who constructed a revolutionary consciousness by drawing from their own cultural heritage, with plantations here newly conceptualized as proto-capitalist forms of socioeconomic organization, allowed James both to reformulate critical aspects of Marxist theories of revolution and historical materialism, and to counter racist ideas about African culture as backward. By the time the vintage edition of Black Jacobins was released in 1963, the real-world problem for James would have explicitly become the problem of development in the newly independent nation-states of the Caribbean, which would also explain his edition of the famous appendix From Toussaint Louverture to Fidel Castro. For David Scott, this shift represents a generic transition in frame from romance, which is his sense of the 1938 Jamesian perspective on revolution, to tragedy, his assessment of imminently faltering nationalist projects. Yet it is also true that throughout the original edition of Black Jacobins, James grapples in complex ways with the questions of how national identity is to be produced, how self-governance is to be gained and what it will mean, how freedom can be envisioned and taken, what sacrifices and alliances must be made, and how leadership is to be cultivated. Of course, these questions regarding leadership, sovereignty, freedom, and autonomy still urgently confront us today, but Williams and James were part of a more general late 19th and early 20th century scholarly and activist trend that was concerned to vindicate the cultural heritage and political potential of Black people globally and to deconstruct Euro-American worldviews related to racial possibility. Williams especially is concerned to dismantle European claims to superiority as the sole, and their claims as the sole inheritors of modernity, and argues persuasively and passionately that the West Indies and the Americas more broadly are nothing if not quintessentially modern. James as well, in adding Haiti to the modern revolutionary canon, argues that Black West Indians, quote, from the very start, lived a life that was in its essence a modern life. For both, the New World geopolitical and structural historical frame of analysis allows them not only to vindicate the humanity of slaves and former slaves, but also to advocate for what they saw as a reparative solution, the achievement of West Indian, quote, national identity. Despite their emphasis on anti-colonial nationalist struggle, these two foundational historical texts, like earlier works by John Jacob Thomas and Antenor Firmin, though in somewhat more complicated ways, dismantled prevalent ideas about civilization, humanity, and democracy through a transnational imperial frame. But there were earlier archivists of Caribbean life who also framed their concerns transnationally. The folklorists and anthropologists who in the 1920s and 30s collected songs, stories, dances, and texts designed to answer questions about, quote, the exact relationship between the Negro in the New World and Bantu races, understood their work in relation to a broader Creole cultural complex that included research being done at the time within the US South, and particularly the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. They sought to develop a program of study that would be geared toward identifying these sorts of Africanisms throughout the Circum-Caribbean more generally. These scholars were attempting to understand the expressive cultural practices of American Blacks, broadly construed, as elements of an African cultural heritage, and ultimately as part of what we might now understand to be a repertoire of traditions transplanted to and transformed by the New World context. While the early folklorists of Jamaica offered catalogues of Anansi stories and work songs, funerary rituals, and dances, there was an agenda to Herskowitz's 1930 provocation to study the, quote, Negro in the New World, which was to chart culture change over time and space with the intention of vindicating a cultural past living in the present. These sorts of projects seem to stand in almost direct opposition to the work of Williams and James, whose primary aim was to deconstruct the modernity of African descendants in the Americas, not to place them in relation to some sort of tradition. The broad regional analytic framework of early 20th century folklorists, however, places them in a structurally sympathetic relationship with James and Williams's projects. Later observers of folklore would move to approximate a more nationalist position in their elaboration of the general post-colonial intellectual and political revisionism of the place of Black West Indians in the modern world. Scholars like Kamau Brathwaite and Sylvia Winter, building on Jean Prisma's reevaluation and affirmation of African-derived folklore in Haiti as the necessary foundation for nationalist development and cultural self-esteem within the context of US occupation, argued against the notion that a process of acculturation is what characterized Caribbean societies. Their view instead was that the dominant European sector, often absent, did not provide a cultural and social scaffolding to which dominated Africans had to acclimatize, but that Afro-West Indians, in maintaining, reconstructing, and transforming their own cultural practices, especially those having to do with land use and religious expression, underwent a cultural process of indigenization that rooted them in the New World. For these scholars, it was the African heritage embedded within the folk culture of West Indian slaves that should be seen as the basis for Caribbean cultural creativity, and thus developed as modern, quote, national culture. The tension between the perspectives of James and Williams and these later folk-based nationalisms, then, is one ultimately rooted in a vision of what constitutes the appropriate space for political action. As the nation-state became the most readily available political container for the strivings for sovereignty that were happening on a global stage, a narrowing of political focus also occurred, despite attempts among scholars and activists to maintain, to one degree or another, a transnational analytic while working toward national independence, which would at the time have appeared as the goal of emancipatory struggle. For scholars like James and later Fanon and E. Franklin Fraser, in usurping the struggle for self-determination from the working classes who rose up to challenge colonial exploitation and underdevelopment, the nationalist bourgeoisie reasserted colonial paradigms and hierarchies while dressing up nationalism in the clothing of culture. Archiving this culture became the dominant project of the immediate post-independence period. And with a number of extraordinary exceptions, scholarly archiving within Caribbean studies began to primarily serve the purpose of validating the particularities of national histories and cultural practices rooted in specific places, rather than maintaining a focus on the space of the region in relation to the complexities of global processes. Of course, historians and folklorists have not been the only scholars to set themselves to the task of rethinking and recreating archives. Novelists and literary scholars have been concerned to both excavate and challenge canons of national and regional literatures throughout the Caribbean, as well as to reconsider what constitutes literature in the first place. Anthropologists have also played a significant role in how we archive our sociocultural realities and our political rationalities. For these scholars, as for Brathwaite and Winter, it has been critical to demonstrate, both to an imperial reading public and to an incipient national one, that the cultural stuff related to religious ideology, ritual practice, dance, movement, and folktales was not, as Europeans would have it, a remnant of backwardness, and therefore evidence that the former slaves were unsophisticated, uncivilized, and ultimately incapable of self-governance and modernity, but should instead be thought of as the foundation of nationalist sociocultural engineering. The African derivation of a number of ritual and social practices has continued to be of critical interest to ethnographers, especially those working on issues related to religious and spiritual practice and, to a degree, music. Many of these scholars, however, have sought to move beyond the frameworks of acculturation and tracking Africanisms and toward an analysis of the ways notions of Africa and slavery are constructed to serve particular narratives of uprootedness, belonging, identity, and legitimacy. Additionally, the extensive anthropological literature regarding family formation that developed after the West Indies-wide labor riots in the late 1930s created an archive that was designed in part to counter the West India Royal Commission's claims that West Indian family structure was dysfunctional, characterized by high rates of illegitimate births, loose family organization, and the, quote, careless upbringing of children. For the authors of the Moyne Report, dysfunctional families were seen to have generated a lack of economic productivity and motivation, and therefore also a lack of ability to participate politically in an engaged and thoughtful way. The report ultimately recommended a movement toward independence for the West Indian colonies, as well as the establishment of an Office of Colonial Development and Welfare to be led by Thomas Saimi, appointed in 1945 as the social welfare advisor for Jamaica. This office was charged not only with seeing to improvements in housing, education, public health, and land resettlement, but also with fostering what they saw as more responsible parenting and sexual restraint. Saimi's own survey of social conditions in Jamaica, welfare and planning in the West Indies, set the pattern for future family studies by delineating types of mating practices, and yes, that's what they were called, and by arguing that there seemed to be a close correlation between color, occupation or economic level, and family type. These findings were echoed, though modified in various ways, by scholars whom Saimi invited to study social conditions in the region, including Edith Clark and Madeline Carr, whose 1952 study was also influenced by the functionalist psychologically oriented studies of family life in the United States. The context within which these studies were conducted was one in which people were captivated both by the possibilities and challenges offered up by self-government. And though many of these early scholars reproduced the ideology that the most appropriate family form was a cohabitational nuclear unit, They also ended up creating an archive of additional forms, for them linked to socioeconomic underdevelopment, that vindicated lower class West Indian actors because they were recognized as having an underlying organization and utility, rather than merely standing as examples of failure to achieve hegemonic middle class norms. The cataloging of family structures, therefore, provided evidence to make a claim that West Indians were indeed, quote, ready for independence, because they had a number of systematic ways to organize the economic and political lives of their communities. The corollary to this anthropological archive is the more recent body of scholarship from sociology, anthropology, literature, and to a degree history that has sought to challenge European claims regarding Black West Indians' hyper and therefore non-normative sexuality. To do this, these scholars have created an archive of sexual practices as well as a critical understanding of their biopolitical management over time, thus historicizing this discursive construction and the various forms of exclusion that have arisen from it. These nationalist cultural archives were designed to contend with the present by historicizing it, by generating evidence that could both counter the old racist epistemologies and serve as the foundations for new, more liberatory claims about the strength and validity of Caribbean societies as autonomous and legitimately sovereign, seeing the achievement of national independence as a form of reparative justice. This has had the effect across the disciplines of dismantling enduring tropes. Black people are unfit to lead. Black people create dysfunctional families. Black people don't have a valuable cultural legacy. Black people are violent. However, despite the transnational processes that have generated these tropes, scholarship in the immediate post-independence period and continuing throughout the 1980s and 1990s became more narrowly framed in terms of its analytic scope. In a brilliant 1992 article published in the New West Indian Guide, Charles Carnegie attributes this to the explosive growth of economics at the University of the West Indies and the concurrent marginalization of the ethnographic methods that have previously been central to social science research. For Carnegie, both the development economics focus and the later growth of Marxist perspectives emphasized, quote, the manipulation of economic forces from the center, end quote, rather than the identification of diverse processes on the ground, under the assumption that, quote, the nation state ought to be the operative unit for measuring economic activity and for effecting policy. This led to a narrow nationalist focus that could not sufficiently account for the aspects of economic or socio-political activity that transcended national boundaries, activities that were regularly and increasingly engaged by ordinary people. While the scholarship emerging during this period may perhaps have been vindicationist, therefore, without the global geopolitical and analytic frame, it could not be reparative. It could not challenge a popular and sometimes academic assertion that the solutions to macroeconomic problems should be pursued through transformations in people's cultural practices and beliefs, and therefore could not deconstruct enduring tropes about Black people globally. After independence, additional archives emerged that, like the history and anthropology of the pre-independence era, were sometimes also vindicationist, but that moved beyond a critique of colonialism and its legacies to also deconstruct the nationalist state. I'm thinking here especially of the immediately post-independence emergence of an archive of women's lives generated by feminist scholars located within and beyond the UE system. These projects countered dominant images of women and illuminated the ways more general economic and political processes redounded negatively to women's lives and therefore to the well-being of entire communities. They began to highlight the extent to which the inequalities that were foundational to the imperial era persisted after independence during a period when development economists were lauding the growth being generated by the tourism and bauxite industries during the 1960s. The more recent project of developing queer archives also gives us new ways to think about what is involved really in the projects of unsilencing the past and present, and provokes us to question the straightforwardness of vindicationist reclamation projects. This is because archiving queer Caribbean lives also turns our attention to the relational dimensions of archive creation and the liberal assumptions about subjectivity that undergird them. Finding queerness in, quote, what the sands remember, to quote Vanessa Agard-Jones, requires a disavowal of the Enlightenment projects of naming, knowing, and categorizing. In other words, the disciplining and biopolitical dimensions of the archiving project, and acknowledges the complexities at play in our endeavors to unearth presences where there have been absences, and the intersubjective politics, performativities, and psychologies that shape these. The challenge being posed by these sorts of archives, alongside longer popular traditions of Ethiopianism, Rastafarian Black Power, has not only to do with the various ways they undo the legitimacy of the state and its policies, calling into question the extent to which the vindication of British West Indian people through the achievement of independence in and of itself could be a kind of reparations. Their challenge also lies in the ways they contest the dominant narrative of Caribbean overcoming, a triumphalist nationalism that sees formal independence as the teleological culmination of, in the Jamaican case, a struggle that began with the Maroons, strengthened through the Sam Sharp and Morant Bay rebellions, gained legible political direction with the 1930s labor rebellions. This triumphalism is grounded in the privileging of resistance as the primary motor of change and personhood, and it is this centrality of resistance that these other archives challenge. While in the first instance, the deconstructionist ethos of James and Williams encouraged a focus on the ways current structural inequalities have emerged and persist as a result of real and codified institutional discrimination, with the ultimate reparative goal being the dismantling of imperialism. Within the context of nationalist vindicationism, we're often left with the sense that current social ills are the result of cultural deviations and dysfunctions, failures and lacks that are passed from generation to generation. This is liberalism par excellence, one that refuses the transnational deconstructionist frame that sees the past living on in the present in complex ways. Let me now turn explicitly to violence and to what archives of violence can show us about how raciality has been linked to sovereignty over time. While C.L.R. James gives us one of the most iconic and detailed accounts of violence during slavery in the Black Jacobins, recent historical work has addressed the topic of violence in a number of innovative ways. Diana Payton's No Bond But the Law foregrounds a legal perspective. Vince Brown's The Reaper's Garden takes death as its organizing rubric. Trevor Bernard engages Thomas Thistlewood's diaries in order to gain insight into the complexities of terror and dependence during slavery. And Doris Garraway's The Libertine Colony addresses violence through a focus on desire and sexuality. Novels like Michelle Cliff's No Telephone to Heaven, Merle Collins' Angel, Marlon James' The Book of Night Women, Margaret Césaire Thompson's The True History of Paradise, and Edwidge Dantica's Breath Eyes Memory, The Dewbreaker, The Farm Ring of Bones, to name only a very few examples, compel us to viscerally engage with the omnipresence of violence and the threat of violence on Caribbean bodies. And the literary theorists who engage these works mine them for how they represent various dimensions of violence as foundational to Caribbean experiences across time and space, even as they also appreciate the particularities of specific contexts. More recently, social scientists have examined the various forms of structural and symbolic violence directed at poor sectors of Caribbean populations and sexual minorities. And this is one area in which anthropologists and ethnographic sociologists have had much to contribute. And while within the Jamaican context specifically, sociologists, criminologists, and other so-called hard social scientists have tended to detail the ins and outs of the development of political violence largely from a national rather than regional or transnational perspective, contemporary ethnographic approaches to violence in the Caribbean have attempted to complicate some of our familiar narratives. As a result, they implicitly open up venues through which we might broaden our analytic frame in ways that make claims for reparative justice possible. I'm thinking here about explorations of political violence, primarily from the vantage point of Jamaica, that have interrogated the concepts of rights and obligations, participation and accountability, sovereignty and autonomy, displacement and trauma. In my own and others' ethnographic work, we see subjects struggling with forms of violence that have accompanied other important societal transformations. In these cases, nationalism and the increasing dominance of the neoliberal agenda over the last 2 decades. The latter context especially has occasioned a significant structural shift in which people, despite intensified economic pressures, have been able to reject the forms of class deference and paternalism they were previously implicitly and customarily forced to perform. Within my own research context, I have identified this phenomenon as modern blackness, an intensified public power for lower class Black Jamaicans that has been generated in large part by migration and the negotiation of American popular cultural production, and that has been experienced by many Jamaicans across class lines, mainly in terms of an intensification of violence and incivility, as has also been the case in many other sites throughout the world. Analyzing these modalities of power and autonomy, the complex and sometimes uncomfortable ways people on the ground express and indeed grab their citizenship within both local and transnational spheres means we must reject facile culturalist reckonings and instead commit to understanding, over a longue durée, the articulation of nationalism, state-making, and violence and their relationships to cultural practice, cultural production, representation, and the realm of the imagination. 10 minutes, so you cut me down, but I haven't had a chance to cut my paper down. I will try to speed through. All right. It's these articulations that vindicationist frameworks cannot meaningfully interrogate, and that must be paramount then when we think about possibilities for reparation, and of course they've motivated my own recent work. So over the past 7 years, I've been involved in a couple projects that have been oriented toward creating archives of state violence. The first dealt with state violence against Rastafari, and one event in particular in 1963 that's now euphemistically called the Coral Gardens Incident. As a result of an ongoing land dispute near the community of Coral Gardens close to Montego Bay, the government, security forces, and civilians were part of a massive roundup of Rastafari across western Jamaica. Hundreds of brethren were jailed, beaten, and tortured, and an unknown number were killed. And this incident was the basis for a 2011 documentary that I made with John Jackson and Junior Gabu Wedderburn called Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens, which we actually toured here last year, exactly this time. The second project, and the one that currently consumes my time and energy, concerns the state of emergency in West Kingston in May 2010 that was declared to apprehend Christopher Dudus Coke, who had been ordered for extradition to the U.S. on gun and drug trafficking charges. This incursion, as it is euphemistically called, is the basis for Tivoli Stories, a multimedia installation and social memory project I'm working on with Junior again, and psychologist Diane Bell. Tivoli Stories is designed to provide a platform through which participating Tivoli Gardens and neighboring community members can recount their experiences during May and June 2010 and name and publicly memorialize loved ones they lost. In both these projects, representing violence, and particularly state violence, audiovisually and publicly, has raised questions about the connections between space and time, about the different truths variously located members of a community are willing and able to acknowledge and examine, and about the potential for repair or transformative justice. So I want to talk just a little bit about the archive of narratives that we're creating with community members and about the insights that we might glean from them. And if you want background on what a garrison community is, what Tivoli Gardens means within the larger structure of Jamaica and the incident itself, I can give you that later. But the impetus for the project was that there was no list of the dead released, and it's only this year, April, almost 4 years after the event took place, that an interim report was released by the Office of the Public Defender. And so people feel like their stories still haven't really been told. So we've been working with people, bringing them into a recording studio, asking them if they're willing, to talk about what happened to them and to publicly memorialize the loved ones that they lost. These narratives will form the backbone of an installation, which I can talk about more later also, if you would like. And we're framing it within a broader context that will tell wholly through archival footage that's about political nationalism in Jamaica, U.S. intervention throughout the region, and the transatlantic trade in drugs and arms. All right, so one of the things that you might ask is why take people to a recording studio rather than recording them in their own community? And this, in fact, is one of the differences in the two archives that I've been working on. And it also raises another sort of archive that I didn't discuss earlier, which is the visual archive of the Caribbean. And there are a lot of scholars who have worked on, what sorts of tropes have been put forward through the various representations over the Caribbean over time, simultaneously virgin and peopled, seductive, sensational, etc., and talking about visuality as itself an imperial project, one that's linked to naming, knowing, classifying, categorizing, etc. And Nicholas Mirzoff has written about counterposed visuality with the, quote, right to look. And that's where we're trying to go with the archives, the visual archives that we're creating. He sees the right to look as the way to forge mutual recognition. That is the basis for the development of political and social subjectivity. And also, we didn't want to shoot in Tivoli. We have shot some in Tivoli, but we didn't want to shoot in Tivoli in part to counter the dominant visual representation of these kinds of communities, which is, to me, a form of ghetto porn. And it's the kinds of visual noise and literal noise that turn people's ears off. And in Jamaica, it's very, very difficult for most people to understand people living in quote-unquote garrison communities, and especially Tivoli Gardens, as human and equally human. So we're trying to remove as much of the noise as we can. Okay. So the narratives that community members are sharing with us tell us not only about what they experienced, which in most cases challenges official narratives about what happened, but they also tell us about three related areas of their lives, and more broadly about life in contemporary Jamaica. They say something about the everyday conditions of structural and symbolic violence and how these are expressed through gender and status. These forms of structural violence also lay the foundations for the periodic eruptions of exceptional violence. They tell us about also how extreme violence produces the experience of time compression, which provides some windows onto the entanglements that undergird forms of structural violence. And they give us a sense of the extent to which people are able to imagine themselves enacting alternative political futures. So let me briefly introduce Sean Bowen, who's been living in Tivoli Gardens for all of his 33 years. Sean was picked up 3 days into the state of emergency when he, along with other men, was taken out of his home, ordered to empty the sandbags community members had piled up to create roadblocks at the entrances of the community, and then taken by truck to the Denham Town Primary School. There, their hands were tied behind their backs and they were taken into the bathroom. You can play the first.
By that time now, I was feeling like it's an execution going to happen right now, because from tie strap behind your back and you're in a bathroom with other rest of men, anything runs through your mind right now. Whereas other people, your family members, no one know where you are. So the only thing you're thinking right now, you're saying a word of prayer, say, boy, mama gonna miss her son now.
Pause. Okay. Sean also talked about being taken, like most men were, to a corporate warehouse where the police were saying to them, no pasa pasa not keeping tonight. So right here, right now, we're going to have pasa pasa. And pasa pasa was a street dance that Tivoli Gardens was famous for, that Dudus had a hand in organizing every Wednesday night. That wasn't just a downtown dance. It was a dance that everybody came to. Go ahead.
So right now, we had to fall in with some clapping. Because it's like a stage show we have to provide for these guys now. To the humiliation that we're under right now. We have to perform a stage show for them clapping, singing, falling in, over DJ, have a DJ and all them things there.
So Sean continued to relate his ordeal, which was common to most male youth in Tivoli Gardens, who were taken from place to place, ordered to sit in their own filth, tied to each other, threatened and occasionally shot at, and ultimately, if they were lucky, taken for processing to the national arena and released and given a certificate of detention. Sean's uncle came for him in a taxi when he was released, and he didn't go back to Tivoli Gardens for another 2.5 months. Sean's experience reflects the structural violence of the garrison system, whereby all male youth are seen as criminals or potential criminals, and young men's options are limited to either legitimate work that they can obtain through their links to a Don, because these opportunities are typically generated through the state contracts that flow to the community from the MP through the Don. Or they get opportunities through illegitimate activist work for the Don himself, or through self-employment, like driving a taxi or running a shop, which is employment that is nevertheless also typically mediated in some way by the local authority of the Don. I make these points not to demonize garrison Dons, but to suggest that their leadership is exploited by elected politicians, and therefore by a broader political system that, since its inception with universal adult suffrage in 1944, has tolerated a parallel political structure. This structure has allowed elected representatives to avoid responsibility for both partisan political violence and involvement in illicit international trades in drugs and arms, and has created the illusion that we are not all complicit in these patterns. What at first sometimes seems surprising about some of these men's narratives, though upon further reflection seems obvious, are the connections that they describe having with various sectors of social and political life outside their community. Sean, for example, told us that beyond regular visits from his baby mother and his son, what kept him afloat materially and spiritually during his period of, quote, exile from Tivoli Gardens was the Japanese expatriate community in Kingston. Because he was a selector for a sound system, he had Japanese friends who looked out for him during and after the state of emergency. Sean's everyday, therefore, includes transnational networks of young Japanese men and women who travel to Jamaica to participate in the very popular cultural practices that are derided locally, both by those committed to a particular notion of respectable citizenship and by those professing a more Marxist point of view, and who therefore see popular cultural practices as distracting to the larger project of socio-political liberation. Yet participation in these spheres of popular culture and other forms of cultural production, while central to several men's broader strategies of negotiation and healing, individually and collectively, also indexes a gendered structural dynamic that invites us to question who has links to the world beyond the garrison, how these links are developed and elaborated, and how this world is strategically mobilized in different ways by men and women. The narratives, I can say more about this later, but so they're telling us, we have these three bunches. One is a set of narratives by women who have lost men, nephews, brothers, sons, fathers in some cases, that are significantly different from these young men's narratives. And they also are telling us something about structural variation within the garrison community, which is important, I think, to policy formulations, because often these sorts of communities are talked about as if they're homogenous and flat in terms of socioeconomic status, and that's not the case, and that people have these various kinds of networks, both to rural communities and transnationally with the U.S. Can also talk more, so that's a spatial form of compression. I can also talk more about the time compression and what that means. For now, let me just skip and mention one of the most striking patterns within the narratives that we've been archiving, and that's the fact that, with only one exception, community members do not say Christopher Coke's name. They duck and parry. They refer to him as that man, the man they were looking for, the man they wanted to extradite. Now, it's important to remember that the context in which we're developing these archives with community members is very much still in the thick of things. So on some level, this is a safety project, right? But I think that we can also think about this in relation to the sorts of projects and processes that, like queer lives and histories, resist archivization. We feel it's related to a broader structural issue within garrison communities that has to do with the narrowing of political imagination and with people seeming to be unable to imagine different political futures. And I can talk more about this, but it's striking because it's the biggest difference between the archive of Rastafari in the 1963 case and this case, and it has to do with the sort of structural psychology of garrison communities versus Rastafari, which has such a broad sort of worldview in which people see themselves as already possessing the tools of their own liberation. Okay. So I'm skipping a lot, and I want to Just say something about how these constitute archives of the non-racial or even of the racial. Explicit discussions of race seem absent from them, and therefore from the broader context in which they're developed and told. But if we look closer, raciality remains an organizing principle for the experiences community members have shared. Let's remember Sean's story about the police forcing them to dance and sing as if they were at Pasa Pasa. As we were recording him, I cringed at this point because what immediately came to mind were the images of slaves being brought up from the ship's hold to dance and drum for traders, concerned with keeping them fit in order to garner a good price at their New World ports of embarkation. Or consider how Annette Irving, a lifelong resident of Tivoli Gardens, whose sister was one of 2 women killed during the incursion, consider how she answered our question about what she thought of the impending commission of inquiry.
Well, I don't know.
You have like translations.
I don't know. I don't think them can compensate you for life. I think them can compensate you for damage to your property. So I don't really know what to say. Because I don't know what them can do. For give you comfort, for ease you from what had happened. It was a massacre. Them have some nice pretty name like Encouragement and for make it, it was a massacre. As I relate to someone, I went to a seminar and I said I am one of them glad about Keith Clark death. And yet I'm sorry because Keith Clark was a human being. But if it never happened outside of Tivoli Garden, nobody wouldn't believe. You sit down in your house and feel the building a shake. It's a bomb a drop. You think you're there in Iraq. The place a shake and live on the ground floor. So imagine the people them up or them they feel. Most of the body them that was buried in that time period, in July, some of the box couldn't open. Because the body them were far state of decomposition. The state took disadvantage of the people them even after the people them relative pass.
In passing, but strategically, Irving mentions Keith Clark, an Upper St. Andrew businessman and brother of former PNP Minister Claude Clark, who was killed on the 27th of May 2010 by the security forces in front of his wife and daughter in the middle of the night. Clark, who was shot 21 times, 16 in the back, suggesting automatic gunfire, was thought to be harboring coke, who had close ties to a prominent businessman who lived nearby. There was intense public uproar over Clark's murder, happening as it did to a member of a prominent family in a wealthy uptown neighborhood. In July 2012, the Director of Public Prosecutions ruled that 3 soldiers would be tried for Clark's murder. The trial date has been set for October 13th this year, after having been postponed several times, and the family is suing the government for $18 million, which is about $160,000 US, in special damages. By comparison, former public defender Earl Witter's interim report on the 2010 state of emergency was not released until April of this year, and the inquiry, which had been imposed by many prominent persons, including the former JLP Prime Minister, is still not underway. For Irving, it was important that the police and military would have acted uptown in the same manner in which they did downtown, in order to give people a taste, as it were, of what it is to live every day with the distinctions that have structured Jamaica's socio-political worlds. That these distinctions are no longer reckoned strictly along color lines, but instead are mobilized in relation to education, occupation, area of residence, participation in certain forms of cultural practice, and notions of respectability, does not mean that they are not still apprehended and experienced as racial. This should confirm for us what we already know. While non-racialism may be a politico-juridical ideal, racial distinctions and inequalities do not disappear with the transition from colonialism to self-government, because race has been a structuring principle of modern sovereignty. Looking at Caribbean archiving practices reveals that the counter-archive that seeks to vindicate racial selfhood is only as emancipatory as the breadth of its analytic frame. Those documentation practices and social movements that have taken the space of the nation-state as their primary mobilizing rubric have accomplished many critical goals, but have ultimately failed to reorient our conceptualization of social and historical processes outside the domain of the cultural, and our visions of the political outside the space of the liberal. Hence, the persistence of the culture of violence and cultural poverty tropes and the patterns of exclusion that characterize the colonial period. Of course, the racial formations and archiving practices within sub-Saharan African contexts are different from those in the Caribbean. However, Cape Town's history as the center of slavery in South Africa, a port city and hub of the Dutch East India Company, recalls Kingston's harbor and the position of Jamaica as the center of the slave trade within the British West Indies. And Johannesburg's urban evolution as a mining center resonates considerably with the mining towns that were at the center of the early Spanish Empire within the Americas. There are, as a result, many similarities between these spaces. Perhaps the parameters of the concern with non-racialism could be shifted slightly from a focus on racial presence and/or absence to an emphasis on scale and process. In this way, we might see the persistence of the racial not as a socio-political failure, but instead as a space of everyday potentiality in which new interventions might become visible, unexpected relations might be highlighted, and innovative possibilities for repair might emerge. Thanks.